well, hello and welcome back. This is our second lecture. Last week we met in person, virtually I guess, and so now here we go. We've got some recorded lectures. This is new to me. It's kind of weird to be, standing in an office with no one around and talking to a computer. So I think over the next couple of lectures, we'll be experimenting with some new techniques just to get used to all this. So I hope this works out well for you all. I'm looking forward to our virtual in-person meetings so we can go over some of these activities and really digest some of this material that we're going over. So let's go ahead and get started on our second lecture, and basically this is our introduction to anatomy and physiology. We're going to learn a little bit about homeostasis and body regions today. So last week, basic introduction, we went over the course. I hope by now you have emailed me or talked with our TAs or SI leaders about any questions that you have as far as how this class works or what to expect. We talked a little bit about your historical, your current, and your future self, and talked a lot about learning techniques, incorporating this material into your long-term memories. So I hope that you take those methods. I hope you take that information and bring it with you through these next, through the entire course really, and really try to apply a lot of this material. So I should turn on my clicker here. All right, what we're going to be doing in this lecture, we're going to be going over these learning outcomes, okay? So defining anatomy and phys, ways of studying, the structural hierarchy that is our bodies. We're going to basically start from the bottom and kind of work our way up. We'll be describing various systems of the body, really spend some time on homeostasis, and then we're going to learn about positive and negative feedback. This is one of those topics that kind of always trips people up, but it's really important in our applications in this semester. So you really need to spend some extra time on that. And then we'll be looking towards the end of this lecture, planes of sectioning and various directional terms and regions of the body. Over here, you'll see the Bloom's taxonomy triangle. And so I had alluded to this last week. And in your BB Learn shells, you'll see the Improving Your Academic Performance document that focuses on Bloom's taxonomy. And so what I'm trying to do here is to take this triangle, these levels, and throughout the PowerPoint, you'll see little tiny versions of this that might have remember, enhanced or enlarged, and understand or apply. And I'm trying to put those into the slides so that you see what I'm thinking as far as how you should be learning, and some of the techniques that you can be utilizing outside of class when you're studying and practicing this material so you perform really well on your exams. So first, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and look at these tools and think about what makes these tools appropriate for the job. All right, so welcome back. If you were looking at these, kind of wondering, what is he talking about? What is he getting at? Well, what's the point here? Well, what makes nail clippers good at being nail clippers, right? Well, it is the structural components of those nail clippers, right? In here, you can see that without this lever and fulcrum here, you wouldn't get any force to put on this edge of those nail clippers. The edge is sharpened so that it can go through the keratin of your fingernails. And if we were to take this little handle here and spin it around, it would lay down flat onto the rest of the structure, and it wouldn't really clip your nails very well. The same is true when we think of a mouse trap. We put some cheese right in here, some peanut butter. When the mouse goes to get that puts some weight on it. It flips this lever out of the way, and this spring-loaded arm kind of snaps back. Same with a vacuum. If you were to pull out the container that holds all the dust or traps all the dust, it wouldn't make a very good vacuum cleaner, because all the dust that you were sucking up would get spread around back out into your house. Okay? So when we think about these tools and these structures, we need to be thinking about our anatomy and our physiology, our form and our function. All right, so what we're going to do is focus on these two learning outcomes: defining anatomy and physiology, and ways that we can study them. So anatomy and physiology is human structure and form, right? The biology of the human form. We are going to be looking at lots of structures throughout the semester, and we're going to be talking about their functionality. So anytime you are studying a term or looking at a vocabulary word or studying an image and you see, a structure there, always be thinking about what is its function, right? And this is going to help us understand how our body works. That's the goal of anatomy and physiology. What does this thing do for us? How does this thing allow us to exist in the world? So, anatomy and physiology, when we talk about these are the foundations for going into these more advanced studies, right? So, healthcare, medical professionals. So, probably a lot of you are in this class because you want to be a doctor or a physician's assistant or a nurse or a physical therapist, right? You might go into pathophysiology, right? So you need to have a really good understanding of our body, the structures and how they work, in order to make bigger picture understanding of the body, okay? And be able to apply those concepts to diseases, to health issues, to healing, okay? So basically, when we think about anatomy and physiology, we are always considering homeostasis, okay? And as we get into homeostasis, we'll talk about how our body regulates and keeps us within a certain environment. So the anatomy part, right? Let's start there. So the study of structure. So we can break down anatomy into different subdivisions. We can talk about the gross anatomy. So as you progress through your semester here at NAU, you may take gross anatomy. I think it's 416 with Dr. Abel. Awesome, amazing class where you're learning all about the body and all the structures in the body, but you're doing it by, inspecting and dissecting a cadaver. We can look at anatomy and talk about systems, body systems. So we might talk about the skeletal system this semester. We're going to talk about the muscular system, nervous system, and tegumentary system. Or we might be very regional, and so we're going to look at the abdominal region or the thoracic region, right? Microscopic anatomy, so looking at cells and tissues and organelles and really small stuff that we need the use of microscopes. And then developmental anatomy is how do we develop over time? When we start from just a zygote, when a sperm and an egg come together, we start as a single-celled zygote and migrate into this organism that has trillions and trillions of cells. So some of the tools of anatomy then is the first and foremost mastering anatomical language, okay? And so you've got to memorize. Anatomy and physiology is known for memorization. There are a ton of new terms, and these are mostly Latin and Greek origin, and so you've got to understand you're not only learning new words that you've never seen before, you're essentially learning a new language, right? So you've got to put the time in to memorize all of these terminologies. And then we need to work on these higher level thinking skills, like understanding, applying, analyzing various systems, okay? A lot of anatomy then also comes from just basic curiosity. What does this body do? What is blood? How does it work? Why do we have it? Why does it come out when we get cut? Right? Observation and inspection. So looking at the body and trying to be very, very deliberate about what it is we see. As you get into the medical field, or maybe you've been volunteering in hospitals or physical therapy offices, manipulating the human form, palpating, right, and touching and feeling around. You've probably been to the doctor for a physical where they're palpating your internal organs to make sure that things feel okay. Auscultation, so listening, right, when we listen to your heartbeat or your respiration, or percussion, kind of thumping on your body and listening to the way that it sounds, maybe if they're thumping on your back a little bit. Okay? And those can give us information about the body and if it's working appropriate or not. So let's practice here really quick. And what I'd like you to do is use your observation skills. What is it that you see on this slide? So pause your video, take a second here, write down a couple of your observations. Okay, so let's revisit this image, okay, in a couple of slides. And let's talk about physiology next. Physiology is the study of function. Okay, so we talked about the study of structure, anatomy. Physiology can be broken down into various subdivisions, and a few are listed right here. Neurophysiology, how does the nervous system work? How does your endocrine system work? What about diseases, okay, or comparative physiology, right? So the essential tools, again, then, is your ability to focus at many different levels. And so when we talk about our structural hierarchy of our human self, our human body, we might need to look at the cellular level or the tissue level, or step back and look at the organ system level, right? And we need to be able to move within these perspectives. So by doing so, that's going to help us get a bigger understanding of the human body and have a better understanding of what's going on if we're in the medical field. Looking at physical principles, so we're going to be learning about electrical currents, pressure and movement of various substances in the bodies. Those are really important. And then also looking at the chemical principles, so even smaller than the cellular level, understanding ions and pH, right, and chemical movements and chemical properties and how they interact. So that is really going to drive our overall functionality. So when you move your arm, it's not just that you're moving your arm. There's things happening at the chemical level, at the cellular level, and at the systemic level, right? And so we need to understand all of that and put all of that into a bigger perspective. All right, so here we are again. What then, based off of your observations, is the function of this structure? And if you didn't pause the video and you're sitting there staring at me, staring at you, it's kind of awkward, right? So maybe just pause your video. All right, so remember, this is our ability to focus at many different levels that allows us to get a big understanding. So maybe some of the observations you made were that you saw an eye, okay? Maybe though, some of your observations were you saw a black circle with a yellow ring around it and then another black ring around that, okay? So if we zoom out a little bit, we need to analyze the world a little bit, right? Stepping back and perceiving the world at different levels. Because here's actually what that is. It's an eye spot. It looks like an eye, but it's actually an eye spot on an owl moth. And so when we think about what is the function of this thing, maybe you saw an eyeball and you said, well, it's to see, duh. But in this case, it's not. It looks like an eye, but it's actually there to deter predation by other organisms so that other organisms might think that this is actually an owl much bigger than the owl moth, okay? So this brings us to my next point, which is observation. Okay, working on your observation skills. Now, when you get into the labs, it's really easy to look through a microscope, make your drawings, and call it good and move on. And then you go home and you try to memorize those drawings, okay? But you really need to pay close attention. With the diagrams in this course, in lecture, and with the microscope slides and the models that you look at in labs, you really want to look at the shapes. Pay close attention. Use all of your senses, right? As best as you can. It's kind of hard to listen to a slide. But using your senses, gaining the information about shapes and colors and locations and tissues present, okay? And then acquiring that information from those senses, right? And that allows us to make an inference. And so when you looked at this image originally, you probably said, most of you probably said, oh, it's an eye. Well, that's actually an inference, right? Because there's a lot of other information that we're sort of assuming based off of the observations of that structure. If I showed you a picture of an owl's face or a whole owl and said, what is this structure? You could say that's an eye, and that's a good observation. But in this case, we're pretty zoomed in and we're making a reference based off of what we're seeing. Okay, so we're using evidence or logical reasoning, and that kind of comes from secondhand knowledge. Okay, it's more of a mental process where we synthesize things, and that helps explain our observations. So as you're studying this semester, really try to ask yourself, am I making an observation or am I making an inference, and how is this going to help me study and remember this information? So we can look at the world, right, through a scientific lens, and that is one way of seeing the world, right? And there's a whole bunch of different ways within the science realm to look at the world. We can look at the world through the eyes of technology, right? Technological fixes to all of our problems. How can we integrate and develop artificial intelligence into the world? We can look at the world through a historical lens, right? But the more that we look around and incorporate all of these perspectives, we get a much bigger understanding of the world, right? We incorporate views in religion and politics and literature and economics, and these all have a lot of importance. As we step back, right, we start to see a bigger picture of what this entire organism is. And in this case, we can see some bees here, sort of symbolic of people kind of interacting with all of these different world views, right, our little hexagons here. And if we step back a little bit more, we see that there is a much larger organism at hand, and there's a lot of other perspectives in the world. And so when we talk about anatomy and physiology, or we talk about a disease, or in anatomy and physiology, we really need to come at this with a much larger worldview, right? Because as you'll find out, and as you proceed through your academic and professional careers, we can say, we're deficient in this one nutrient, and that's causing this problem. But that may not solve that person's disease. There might be cultural perspectives, there might be a religious perspective, there might be familial issues that are behind all of this, right? And so I want you to keep that in mind as we kind of proceed through this course as well. Okay, so I'll get off of my philosophical soapbox here and come back to what's called the principle of complementarity. Anatomy and physiology are inseparable, okay? They always reflect they are always interconnected. So our function of a structure always depends on its structure, okay? Without a certain form, if that mousetrap doesn't have a spring on it, that metal bar is not going to spring back. If we are trying to use that hammer as a paintbrush, you could probably do that, but it doesn't work as good as a paintbrush, right? If you're trying to use your vacuum as a tool to eat spaghetti, it's probably not going to work as well, right? So all of the things that we're learning as we move forward, the structure reflects the functionality, okay? All right, so let's move on into our structural hierarchy, and let's talk a little bit about how our bodies are constructed. So go ahead again, pause this video, don't stare at me staring at you, and put these, 7 in order. Put these 7 structures in order, from smallest to largest. Okay, so how did you do? Let's go ahead and put these in order. So at the very basic level, we have 1 and 2 are atoms and our molecules. So this would be considered our chemical level. Our next highest level up would be cells and organelles, as you can see right over here. So this first unit will be focusing on the cellular and the organelle level, as well as some of the molecular and atomic level. Cells, groups of cells, come together to form tissues. Tissues, 2 or more groups of tissues, will form organs. Organs that work together form organ systems. So in this case, you can see the digestive system here. And then organ systems working together give us our organismal level. And that's where we're going to need to be able to have different perspectives along the way. And there is Quest. So we'll make this more real to my life. That's my youngest child. He's 11 months at this time of this recording. That's Quest. So and his name's Quest because he was 8 weeks premature, almost came out at 14 weeks. Our first child journey actually was 10 weeks early. So we are the world of preemie babies over here and living in NICU. So I can tell you all about NICU, and maybe some of you spent some time in NICU. So we can share stories. All right, now, the other thing to keep in mind is with biology, there's always those outliers, right? We try to categorize. We try to put things in good, nice, clean compartments for our learning, but there's always these outside, outliers, okay? Just the same with anatomical variation, okay? None of us in this class are exactly alike. About 70% of our body and our form is the same, okay? But about 30% of us about 30% of our bodies will be some variation that we see from others, right? With size, or maybe we have extra muscles or missing muscles, or an extra branch of a blood vessel, right? And so we can talk about this variation in organ locations, right? So you might have your body, as we go through, we're going to learn that this structure is in the right upper quadrant. We're going to learn that this structure is on the left side of the body. But sometimes that's actually reversed, so situs inversus. And so people will have their entire internal organs flipped on the inside. And so it's really important to be able to visualize what bodies should look like, and then as you're working on people, kind of understand how that is going to change. So here's a couple of images just to show you. Up here on the left, you can see a normal kidneys. Sometimes you might have a pelvic kidney where that kidney is actually not where it's supposed to be up here, and we've got our adrenal gland up here, but the adrenal gland's there in the right place, but the kidney is actually way down here. Or both of your kidneys will actually unite and you'll have this big horseshoe kidney. In the bottom, we've got a normal heart with its vessels branching off of the aorta. But what we can see is that we have different variations of those branches. And so as you go through labs and lectures and your next couple of years in classes learning about physiology and anatomy, you also have to remember that this is not always the case, right? There are variations. So let's talk about organ systems. And we're going to list them and describe those body systems. So again, pause here and think about what organ systems are in your body. So there's 11 total. See if you can write down all 11. All right, so how'd you do? we are going to go over these organ systems. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly, so please revisit these slides and make sure that you either pause your video and take notes or come back and make sure you understand these. You will be expected to know these for your tests and quizzes, but as we go through the semester, you'll be learning about these more in detail. So, I just want to touch on these briefly so that you kind of get a basic idea of what we're looking at. All right, so the integumentary system, this is our skin. This covers our entire body. It's the largest organ of our bodies, okay? It protects us, it keeps pathogens out, and it keeps water and all of our fluids inside, helps us synthesize vitamin D. We see that we have lots of receptors in our skin, so we can feel, light touch or deep touch. So we know if there's an insect that lands on us, we kind of understand our place in the world as we move through it. And we also see lots of glands, so sweat glands, oil glands, and those are embedded into our tissue. And so we'll be learning a lot about those this semester. Another system we'll be covering in 201 is our skeletal system. So our skeletal system protects our internal organs, gives us support, holds us up, allows us to move, and is the framework for our muscular system to interact. Okay, without our bones, our muscles couldn't engage and move us. Our skeletal system helps us form blood and also stores minerals. We'll also be looking at how the muscular system works. We'll be focusing on skeletal muscle in here. You'll learn about how cardiac muscle works in 202. And so the muscular system, it helps us manipulate the external environment. It helps us move around. It helps us with facial expression, right? Helps us with posture and produces heat, keeps us warm if we get cold. And then we'll also be looking at the nervous system in here, and we'll be really going into depth on the nervous system. This is how we respond to internal and external changes or sensations or sensory information. And this is what's activating and communicating with our muscles and our glands and telling our body how to function. In 201, you'll be hitting the endocrine system, but we'll talk a little bit about some hormones throughout this semester. So you'll see some of it here. So this is going to regulate our growth, reproduction, metabolism, all kinds of functions with our endocrine system. Our cardiovascular system is how your body pumps and transports blood, and by doing so, it also pumps and transports gases and nutrients and wastes. The lymphatic system is kind of, you can think of like the washing machine of our body. Okay, it's picking up leaked fluid, it's cleaning it, it's scanning our body for anything that is pathogenic. It's looking for debris, old pieces of cells and stuff that have been damaged. And this is part of our immunities as well. Okay, and so when you learn about the immune system in 202, you'll be talking about the lymphatic system in great detail. Then our respiratory system, this is what brings oxygen in and takes carbon dioxide out. This also helps us maintain a pH balance in our bodies. Then our digestive system, breaking down food, absorbing nutrients, and getting rid of all the things that we don't know or don't need. We'll touch on the digestive system a little bit in here and talk about how that kind of is helping with osmosis and movement of nutrients. The urinary system is what's helping us regulate our water and electrolyte balance. It also does have some balance with the pH system, kind of regulates our acid and bases, and is getting rid of nitrogenous wastes. And then finally is our reproductive system, probably the most fun and exciting system to learn about. And so this is producing offspring, making sex hormones. So when we go through puberty, how does that change our bodies? Producing eggs and sperm, and also our secondary sex characteristics. So how do we change again during puberty? Now, I put this in here because what's, again, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see I've got our little Bloom's taxonomy there with analyze, right? So when you think about these systems are not independent of each other. They all interact in a very highly orchestrated manner. And so in this instance, right, you can see that our digestive system is bringing in nutrients and food. Well, those nutrients make their way into our circulatory system, okay? What's left is, removed through our feces, but those nutrients then are circulated throughout our body, pumped by the heart, and they will then, diffuse into our cells and into the interstitial fluid, and that's where our lymphatic system will help clean up the leaked fluid. Our respiratory system also engages and interacts with all of this because O2 and CO2 are then cycled throughout our blood, and O2 and CO2 are transported, O2 into our cells, CO2 back out of the system. And over here we can see our urinary system then is taking excess nutrients, wastes, metabolic wastes, things that our cells don't need and that are putting off, that are recycled and picked up, and those are going out and being deposited through our urine, right? And the whole system then is surrounded by our integumentary system. And so all of these systems are made of tissues that we're going to be learning about, and those are made of specific cells that all have specialized functions, and we're going to learn a lot about how all this works. So you could pause the video here. You can go through these different systems and think about how they might interact. So how does the nervous and the endocrine system interact? How does the endocrine and the muscular system might those interact, right? So again, be thinking about the bigger picture as we move through this semester. Okay, so here we are. We're going to talk a little bit about metabolism and homeostasis. So as you can see in this diagram, we've got this big circle that is to represent basically our bodies. We have, oops, there was my pointer. We have food. We bring that food into our bodies, and through catabolic reactions, we're going to break that food down into its component parts, and we're going to have smaller pieces. So catabolism is breaking down larger substances into smaller substances, and by doing so, we release energy. I'm also going to pull up a laser pointer here, and we'll just keep this down here so I have it when I need it. And then our anabolic reactions take our component pieces and build larger structures. So as we eat food, we're going to break those down into lipids and carbohydrates and amino acids, and then anabolic reactions are going to take those pieces and turn them into whatever our body needs, proteins or new mRNA or whatever that instance calls for, and this requires energy. So we're giving off energy and we're using energy. So let's take that thought of metabolism and let's talk about homeostasis, okay? And so again, homeostasis here is trying to keep us within balance, all right? So this image is going to be a really important image for you to know. Like, you've got to memorize this thing. You've got to get this down. These terms we will be coming back to it throughout the entire semester, okay? And so this is like foundational AMP knowledge that you need to know. So what do we have here? All right, so here's our balance beam, right? We've got our triangle, we've got our little fulcrum here, and we've got our balance. And when that comes out of balance, okay, what this is showing is, oh, we've changed, okay? So number one here is showing that there's some kind of stimulus. So the external environment might be too hot, might be too cold. The internal environment, maybe your calcium levels are too high or too low, or your pH comes out of balance. There are receptors that detect that change, okay, and detect this change from balance into imbalance. Now, they send that information along an afferent pathway. So think A away from the receptor, okay? And so that information is sent along the afferent pathway, and that's taken and delivered to a control center. The control center then is going to process what just happened and make meaning of it and respond to that stimulus or that change. So if it's your calcium levels are too high, the control center says, well, wait a second, we need to bring that back down. That's too much. And so it sends a signal through an efferent pathway. So the efferent pathway is exiting the control center, E for E, and that's going to go out to our effectors. So we're going to have some kind of physiological effect, so hence effector. So that effector then has some kind of response to then bring our imbalance back into balance. So if our calcium levels are too high, we're going to change that system to bring those calcium levels down. Right? So this is our basic generalization of how this is going to work. So you don't need to memorize these numbers. This is just some examples to show you normal ranges for fasting blood values. So if you've ever had your blood drawn or you've had to go get a panel, you wake up usually super early in the morning, you haven't eaten all night, you're fasting for 8 or 12 hours, and then they draw a bunch of blood and then they look at all these levels to see where are you at. Why fasting? Well, fasting, if you're eating food, you can alter these levels, and so fasting gives us kind of a baseline of what is our body doing on its own. Okay, so some of these ranges are really, really small, and there is not much room for change because our body doesn't want to work outside of those values. So here, pause the video and take a little bit of practice. Review and reinforce. You'll see these slides over and over again. I like to kind of stop after bigger chunks of topics and make sure that you have an opportunity to digest that information. Okay, so how did you do with these questions? So what is the difference between homeostasis and metabolism? Homeostasis then is basically keeping our body in balance, while metabolism is the sum of all of our chemical reactions, so our anabolic and our catabolic reactions in our body. Describing the pathway that homeostatic mechanisms receive information and make a change. So this was referring to the diagram. We have a stimulus coming in, it's picked up by a receptor, it's passed along that afferent pathway to a control center, which then integrates that information, sends out the information through an efferent pathway to an effector that has some kind of effect on the body and brings us back into balance. And then can you name all 11 body systems and a function for each? So make sure that you can go through and do that. I'm not going to go over all those right now, but again, on a test, I would ask you, this body system is involved with removing metabolic wastes. And I'd give you maybe 4 or 5 options to choose from. Okay. Now, on that note, these are some example questions off of my tests. So I would encourage you to look over these and to think about these. You may see the same question on a test or a quiz, or you might see a variation. I change these every semester, but I think that it's really important for you all to see what kind of questions I ask you before you take a test, right? Usually the first test is always harder because the students are trying to figure out, how is this person going to ask me about this information? What is the test going to look like? These are straight off of past exams, okay? So question number 4 here, studying internal structures by listening to the body surface is called. And so basically this is just a straight memorization question, okay? So low level, can you memorize these terms? Do you know what they are? Question number 5, a blank is composed of a granular cluster of 8 proteins called blank with DNA wrapped around them. plus a short segment of linker DNA. This one's a little bit harder, right? Because now you have two terms that you need to know and you need to be able to identify their definitions, but it's also asking you to kind of apply that information. So what is the structure that has 8 proteins, and what is it called when you have DNA wrapped around them plus the linker DNA? That changes things, okay? So it's a little nuanced, but if you don't spend time looking at the diagrams of the lectures, that shows you a difference between a nucleosome and a chromatosome, okay? So you're gonna, again, have to be paying attention to some of those things. Number 10, number 10, the principle of complementarity refers to A, B, C, 2 of the above or none of the above, okay? So again, people hate these questions, and I'm sorry, but you will see these questions on your tests, and it's always that psychological back and forth of, oh, I'm pretty sure I know this, I hate these 2 of the above. You've got to know what you're talking about, and you've got to be able to eliminate ones that aren't correct, okay? So function always reflects structure, or is it the structure always reflects the function, right? What a structure can do doesn't depend on its specific form. Well, we can cross that one off. And the fact that anatomy and physiology are inseparable. Well, we know that one's true. And so A is just flipped around. So structure always reflects function, right? So that is going to be a 2 of the above. And then 46, primary lysosomes fuse with vesicles to form secondary lysosomes, and their purpose is to blank. Again, we're going to see this in the cell lecture, but what is the functionality? I'm going to be asking you lots of function questions on these tests. So take some time, make questions like this as you're studying, and I'll give you some more examples before our first exam. Let's talk a little bit about feedback here. Now, negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops is some kind of response that is going to shut down or turn off the original stimulus. So again, we're talking within our homeostasis topic here, okay? So we have this on this image. You can see we have our normal range, and we have our set point or our average, right? And we do always have some normal fluctuations above and below that. And so our body is constantly working to keep our bodies within that normal range, okay? And that is what homeostasis is. Now, we regulate that mostly through negative feedback loops. So if we talk about temperature, as you can see here in the upper right, we've got our average normal range of our body temperature. So our average temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. If it gets too cold, our body temperature drops, and what ends up happening is our control center sends out a signal through that efferent pathway back to our effectors or our muscles to shiver. And as we start to shiver, we generate a little bit of heat, and that little bit of heat should hopefully bring us back to our normal range or our baseline. Here, that shivering would be our negative our negative feedback. It's shutting down that original stimulus. If you go outside and you're walking around or you're running or you're at the gym, you start to sweat, and that sweat then cools off our body through evaporation. And so again, your body temperature goes up. You are sending a stimulus to your control center through an afferent pathway. Control center then sends a signal to your effectors to turn on your sweat glands, and that is going to bring your body temperature back down. So again, it's a negative because we are shutting down that original stimulus. So just another way to look at this, when we bring in that balance beam that we had here, and things go out of whack, right? So our body temperature goes up. Our receptors, temperature sensitive cells in the skin and the brain, then send a signal along our afferent pathway to our control center in our brain. Control center says, whoop, out of balance, cool it off, bring that body temperature down. And so we send a signal to our sweat glands. Our sweat glands release water to the surface of our skin, and it's evaporated, and that body temperature is brought back to normal. If it drops too low, again, we have that stimulus coming in through our afferent pathway to our control center. We send information along the efferent pathway to our skeletal muscles to shiver, and again, that's going to help us bring that body temperature back up. Now we can look at some other examples with this. So another good example is blood glucose. So a lot of you may be familiar with this. If you are eating food, as you can see over here on the left, we eat some food, we break that down in our digestive system, that glucose then gets into our blood and our blood glucose levels go up. Here, our pancreatic islets in our liver, our pancreatic islets in our pancreas, then actually are our sensor, our integrating sensor, and our effector. So they actually, you can see this throughout the body, that some organs have multiple functions. They release insulin. That insulin increases in our body, and what happens is we increase the uptake of glucose by our cells, and that brings our blood glucose levels back down. So that is our negative feedback until our blood glucose goes back up again. If we fast, we're getting ready for our blood draw in the morning. We're going to go to the labs. Our blood glucose levels drop. Our pancreatic islets are stimulated. They reduce the amounts of insulin, and they increase another hormone, glucagon. That glucagon decreases, that glucagon is going to increase our glucose secretion into the blood by our liver, and therefore our blood glucose levels go up, again, shutting off that original signal of a low blood glucose. If we look at blood pressure, you've probably all experienced this. You're lying down and you stand up really quickly. Well, your blood pressure falls. Your blood pressure receptors are then stimulated. We send information to your medulla oblongata. This is our integrating center. It sends information through an efferent pathway to your autonomic nervous system. We increase your heart rate, and that increases your blood pressure. Again, effectively shutting down the drop in blood pressure. So these are all examples of negative feedback. I'd recommend drawing out all of these diagrams so that you can get some practice with the terminology and the concepts there. Okay, now moving on to positive feedback systems. This is where a deviation from our set point is actually amplified and not turned off. Okay, so a couple of examples here from an environmental standpoint is if we talk about global cooling and global warming, right? So as the temperature of the environment cools, we get more ice growth. As ice grows, we increase our albedo, or the reflectivity of the sunlight, and so more sunlight is reflected and we have less heat, and so that continues to cool. What we're tending to see now is more warming, which is melting more ice, and that decreases the reflectivity of the sunlight and the energy, and it actually exposes more land and water, and that actually absorbs a lot more heat, and that adds more warming to the atmosphere and to our climate, and we have this positive feedback cycle. Okay, so our first example is blood clotting. All right, now if we look at this image over here, we can see that we've damaged the blood vessels. So you've slammed your finger in a car door, or you've cut it while you're making a fancy 5-course meal for your loved one. And so what happens is this is a bad situation, right? We don't want blood getting out of our blood vessels. That is not helpful to our body. So we want to shut that down, but we want to do it very quickly. Okay, so here we have a break or tear, and we stimulate a positive feedback cycle. So platelets will then be sent to our damaged blood vessel. They release chemicals to stimulate more platelets to come back to our damaged blood vessels. more chemicals, more platelets, more chemicals, more platelets, more chemicals, more platelets, and they create a plug which then stops the bleeding. That is our amplification to bring back and turn off that system. At some point, we don't need to have any more platelets and any more chemicals being released because we've now shut down the bleeding and we've been able to fix this damage. Okay, so what about birth? This is another great example. So here's Journey. I put his face in here. He did not look like that when he was born. He was like real small. So like 3 pounds, 12 ounces. So yeah, he was a little guy. All right, now what's happening? So the head of the baby pushes against the cervix right in here. As we have that head pushing against the cervix, we get nerve impulses that are sent up to the brain. Those nerve impulses then are translated into something meaningful, and the brain then says, whoa, there's something pushing on the cervix. Let me release some oxytocin. That oxytocin is transported through the circulatory system into the uterus, where it then stimulates uterine contractions. So around the child is the uterus here, and smooth muscle, and those muscles then contract and they push the baby's head onto the cervix. That stretches the cervix, it transmits to the brain, it releases more oxytocin goes to the uterus, and we get more contractions, which causes more stretching, and then eventually that baby is pushed out, and then the body can return back to its normal state. If you know anything about Ace Ventura. All right, now, when we talk about our bodies coming out of balance, right, and we can see this really wonderful gymnast over here on the left with just incredible balance on the right, and we see this gentleman not so good at balance and not doing super good at hiking. So what can happen when our bodies get out of balance is that we generally can see the prevalence of diseases. So diabetes is a great example of that. As we age, we tend to see the increased prevalence of diseases, and we see our bodies coming out of homeostasis. So just practice a little bit. Again, what is negative? What is positive feedback? Negative feedback keeps us in balance. Positive feedback is non-homeostatic. Negative feedback, the deviations from a set point are resisted. We try to bring them back, while in positive feedback, the deviations are amplified, and eventually they will come back to normal. That results in stability for our negative feedback system, and our positive feedback is a short-term response, right? We cut ourselves, and we have birth, or we're giving birth, we need to end that pretty quickly, hopefully quickly. So here's an example, some example questions that if you wanted to pause right now and go over these, and or you can come back and revisit this a little bit later. Okay, so now we're going to move on to dividing up our body into different planes and into different regions. So you probably have seen this in your labs and your first lecture of labs, but anatomical planes and position. So here's this woman over here to the left, and she's divided into 3 different planes. Now, planes obviously are imaginary flat surfaces that we like to use, and so we have our sagittal plane, and this is going to divide our body into right and left. So this is our sagittal, and you can see that in this diagram here, it's labeled as mid-sagittal. I'm going to turn on the laser pointer here. And we only have one mid-sagittal plane. That is an equal left and right sides, but we also have parasagittal planes that go basically from any direction, left or right, and there's infinite parasagittal planes, and those are going to divide the body into unequal left and right sides. Our frontal plane then over here is going to divide our body into anterior and posterior planes. And then our transverse or our horizontal plane is going to divide our body into superior and inferior portions. So again, infinite amounts through the body here. So really quick, go ahead and pause your video and practice these planes. What do you think we have here? Okay, so how did you do? First one is a sagittal. We can call it a sagittal because we don't really know exactly where it is. Most likely it's mid-sagittal, but we can call that a sagittal plane. This one here is a frontal plane, dividing the body into anterior and posterior. And then last would be our transverse plane here, which is going to divide our body into superior and inferior portions. All right, so where are we here? What do you think? So it's kind of tough, right? Maybe if we don't know our geography very well, it's a different perspective of the world, and so it might be kind of hard to identify exactly where we are, but you might say India. I would say good job. All right, now if we draw in some lines, it makes it a little bit easier to see where we are, right? And so yeah, we are now in India. But if we zoom in a little bit and we then add in some territories, we can see a little bit more information. And we can also see right over here, we've got New Delhi, and so we are in fact in the capital, right? So as we zoom in and as we break up these large regions of land, we get a little bit more information. Just like with the United States, we can take the United States, we can break it into the west, the northwest, the southwest, the south, okay? And that kind of tells us where we are in this country. Now, some directional terms you're going to need to memorize. You're going to have to get these down. So tonight, I would make flashcards of all of these terms. You're going to use them in labs. You're going to use them in lecture. So make sure that you get these down, okay? So ventral and dorsal, this is toward the front or the belly or toward the back of the spine. We generally use these more for quadrupeds, but we do use these with humans. So you will see this. They're very similar to anterior and posterior, so toward the ventral side and toward the dorsal side. Superior is above, inferior is below, medial is towards the middle, lateral is to the side, proximal is closer to a point of attachment, distal is farther away from a point of attachment, superficial then is towards the body surface, and deep is farther from the body surface, okay? Now what's really important to know is when you use these directional terms, they are used in reference to something else. So if we look over here, the heart is superior to the diaphragm. If you say the heart is superior, it doesn't really make any sense because it's not in reference to something else. Here, then, we could just flip this around and say the diaphragm is inferior to the heart, or here, in this case, the liver is inferior to the diaphragm. So it's always in relation to something else. So here we have a human body broken into regions. Just like we have the United States broken into regions, we will break our body into regions. Now, a lot of the more common ones are going to be the ones that you're going to be expected to know. So you're going to learn about a hallux in lab. You're going to learn about digital, metatarsal, tarsal, fibular, crural for leg. Your patellar is your knee. Your femoral region is your thigh. So you should spend some time practicing these regional terms and making sure you can answer these on a test. I'll probably ask you 1 or 2 questions on a test. I'll give you a diagram and have you label it or answer what that region is that I'm pointing to. All right, now we also have membranes that line a lot of these cavities, okay? And so we call them serous membranes, okay? as you can see over here. And so these membranes are around these body cavities. Now that helps to reduce friction, and it also helps to reduce the spread of disease throughout our body. So there's two layers generally that we associate with these, and so we have our parietal serosa. In this case, because we're talking about the heart, we have our parietal pericardium. Peri means around or near, cardium is the heart, so around the heart. But paria means wall, and so the parietal pericardium is more superficial or closer to the body wall, where the visceral pericardium is in contact with the organ. So viscera means organ, and so the visceral pericardium basically means the layer that is around the heart that's in contact with the heart itself. Now, in between those two layers, we have the pericardial cavity. Now, this is an over-exaggeration of the size of the cavity. It's more of like a false cavity, and so there's a little bit of fluid inside of it that gives it a little bit of space, but it isn't this big gaping hole. And so inside of there, we have serous fluid, and that serous fluid acts as lubrication. It acts as like the engine oil of your car, so that you don't have friction of the visceral and parietal pericardia rubbing against each other, and that would be bad. So your heart is constantly beating, so it needs lubrication to have nice resistant-free contractions. So here are our body cavities. We can see that we have a dorsal body cavity over here. We have a ventral body cavity over here. That dorsal body cavity is composed of our cranial cavity and our vertebral cavity, which is going to house our spinal cord. And our ventral body cavity then has our thoracic cavity, our abdominal cavity, and our pelvic cavities within them. And then within those cavities, we have other organs. So in our abdominal cavity, we'll see our digestive organs, right? In our thoracic cavity, we see our heart and our lungs. Okay, so make sure that you practice these body cavities. And then what we can also do is further divide the body into quadrants. So in this case, we have the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. And they are associated with certain organs. So you might come in, or you might have a patient that comes in and says, wow, I got this sharp pain right up in this upper part right here. And so for you, you're immediately thinking, oh, okay, so what might that be? Is that a liver? Is that a gallbladder issue? If they're saying, it's down in this right spot down here, you might be thinking, ooh, that might be an appendix, right? So we can compartmentalize our organs. So pause the video here, take a few moments, practice some of these questions and this content that we just went over. All right, so the knee is superior to the ankle. The muscles would be superficial to your bones, so they're closer to the body surface. Your patient presents with pain in the lower right quadrant. What might that be? Well, just to flip back here, the right lower quadrant, probably some kind of appendicitis going on in there, something wrong with the appendix, but it also could be something with the large intestine or part of the small intestine. Which quadrant are the liver and stomach located in? Well, respectively, the liver is mostly in the right upper quadrant, and your stomach is mostly in the left upper quadrant. And then name the specific region for these common locations. So I'm going to let you go back and look those up to see how you did, because you're going to need to practice all those. All right, now we've made it through all of these learning outcomes. Thanks for hanging in there. This is a long lecture, but again, I encourage you to spend some time today, go back through all of those terms, make flashcards, start printing out some of those diagrams, start labeling things, and get in as much practice as you can before our next lecture. Thanks and have a great day.